Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think I must thank Rashtriya Raksha University and the organizers for inviting me for this particular seminar. Well, before I start, let me clarify. I am Captain Alok Bansal, a naval officer who served in the Indian Navy for 32 years. I am also a PhD in International Affairs from Jawaharlal Nehru University and have been a professor of Pakistan Studies in Jamia Millia Islamia for 3 years. So, and somebody said South Asian Institute for Strategic Affairs, part of India Foundation. Those are two different organizations. I am Director, India Foundation. South Asian Institute for Strategic Affairs is also an organization which I founded. I was the founder, executive director. I am not holding any executive post in that organization. Having said that, the subject that's been given to me is very interesting. It says, Geopolitical and Security Analysis of Contemporary Conflicts. I was actually wondering why this subject has been given to me, because I've spoken on various topics across the globe, primarily focusing on geopolitics. I have been a Pakistan studies professor, so Pakistan is normal, lot of country. I have been to each and every neighboring country of India, so which includes badlands like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, to China, Myanmar, and all these countries. So a lot of people call me for India-China relations, etc. And a lot of people call me for radicalization, but this was a very interesting subject actually, which I had never spoken on. So I thought I'll probably take some time. Now, when you talk of geopolitical and security analysis of contemporary conflicts, the first thought that comes to my mind as a military man is war. I try to correlate conflict with war. War, of course, everybody knows. I think we've all studied. Clausewitz says war is nothing but continuation of politics by other means. In fact, Sun Tzu said that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. But then when I pondered over it, I realized war and conflict are not the same actually, and that we need to do. So what is conflict? Firstly, we need to decide what conflict is actually. If you look at Oxford Dictionary, it has two meanings. It says a fight or an argument or a difference between two or more ideas. That's what says Oxford University. A more appropriate meaning of conflict for an organization, for an audience like this would be a struggle or clash between opposing forces. So, if you have this broad definition of conflict, so what are the contemporary conflicts? Now that comes to a point. Now you have Council on Foreign Relations, which has a very interesting global conflict tracker. If you actually go by that, there are 28 global conflicts as they probably work out. Of course, some of them in our neighborhood, of course, I won't go into all 28 of them, but if you actually look at some of them in our neighborhood, one is instability in Pakistan, one is, of course, India-Pakistan conflict in Kashmir, whose manifestation we saw just the other day, very recently, and what we are seeing. Then there is a civil war in Myanmar. So there are so many others which are going on. If you go by International Crisis Group, they again look at different conflicts. And being a European think tank, they probably think what's happening in Europe is okay. So let's look at other conflicts. So in their list of 7 major conflicts, they have Gaza, Yemen, South Sudan, DR Congo and Rwanda, the conflict going on, Ethiopia and Eritrea. So this is how they perceive it. Of course, they say there are 4 conflicts which have actually worsened. That is Syria, Burkina Faso, Turkey and Haiti. So which all conflicts to analyze? Because if I start analyzing every conflict, I think these 3 days would be insufficient, I think so. And I think you would appreciate that. So what I did was that I went through the list of fatalities and things like that. And when you look at the fatalities, actually, the conflict which has actually which has resulted in the maximum loss of lives is Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, if you look at it last year, Ukraine lost 72,960 people and Russia lost 4,737. And if you add to it, within this year, in 2025, there have already been deaths of about 26,510 people. So, in terms of fatalities, definitely a very important conflict. So I thought I ought to analyze that. That we would be discussing certainly. The second, of course, in terms of conflict is Palestinian one. You are seeing what's happening in Gaza, which has actually intensified. Last year, there were close to 30,000 fatalities. This year already, it's touching 6,000. So it's again a very severe one. But the problem with Palestinian conflict is that if I start analyzing it, and I would love to do it, but it would at least take 2 hours because it's such a long drawn process. So probably we could take it on during Q&A, but I'd try and skip it if possible. The next conflict, which very often we don't realize, which is actually next door and which has actually had major fatalities, is Myanmar. We actually seem to ignore it as if it's somewhere back of beyond. Last year, close to 20,000 people died in Myanmar. And in this year, already over 4,400 people have died. What are the dimensions of this conflict? And this conflict has a direct impact on us, both security as well as geopolitical. Of course, thereafter, we have a very strange conflict which has actually very serious implications. That is Sudan, which the world seems to have forgotten. Why? Because it is in Africa. Sudan doesn't produce that much of oil that it should concern. It does produce oil. It's not that it doesn't produce oil. But it's a very unique conflict. There is no ethnic angle to it. There is no religious angle to it. There is no ideological angle to it. It is pure power grab. It's a pure elite conflict. Since the world doesn't pay attention, I thought I'll also ignore it because Africa is back of beyond. Nobody wants to discuss it. What's happening in Democratic Republic of Congo, nobody wants to do it. One more conflict which I would like to discuss, which is again amongst the top 10 conflicts, is the Syrian conflict. In fact, I'd rather like to start with that conflict because it's a very strange conflict and it has a huge geopolitical ramification. What happened in Syria? There was a movement for democracy. How the turbulence started. Bashar al-Assad, who had been in power for decades, and Assad family had been ruling Syria for decades, was actually shaken up. Now, how a state's reaction manifests also is driven by what's happening in other parts of the world. Please understand the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, where it succeeded, moved to Egypt, moved to Libya, moved to Yemen, moved to Syria. And initial successes were there, like everywhere. Tunisia, you had a transformation. Egypt also, you had a transformative government. But by the time it came to Syria, Bashar al-Assad saw what was happening. The way Muammar Gaddafi was actually hunted down and killed, I think it told Bashar al-Assad that you have to dig in and fight. And he dug in. What is even more important with the Syrian conflict is that for the first time after 1991, the former superpower of the globe, Soviet Union, which had actually reduced itself to Russian Federation, decided to intervene in an area outside the former Soviet Union. Now, Putin intervened, and that actually prevented and sustained Bashar al-Assad in power. So this is a very important geopolitical factor. It established that Russia was not a spent force. It was still a force to reckon with. And the sustenance of Bashar al-Assad in power actually showed to the world that Russia has re-emerged. So the conflict continued. Who were supporting the democracy at that point of time? Countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Well, their own democratic credentials were at best questionable, if not laughable. But now what happened? Now what happened in the Syrian conflict? There were different powers. When the conflict started, you saw emergence of Al-Qaeda initially. Al-Qaeda broke up. There was a front called Al-Nusra. And then you saw the advent of Islamic State, which started from Syria, captured a huge territory in Iraq, and created a new force. A huge geopolitical implications. In fact, Islamic State continues to dominate the discourse today also. And people may say Islamic State is over with Mosul's recapture, but the fact is Islamic State's influence is all pervasive. You have outfits aligned to Islamic State across the globe today. So Islamic State emerged. With Russian support, you had Shiite forces coming and supporting Bashar al-Assad. Incidentally, Alawites, Shias, were considered heretics by mainstream Shias till then. The Ithna Shariyas or the 12er Shias considered Alawites as heretics. But when they saw an opportunity, they got together. Like Zaydis or Houthis today, who are fighting in Yemen, were considered heretics by 12er Shias. They never considered them as proper because there were huge ideological differences. But the US and the Western world has allowed Shias to congregate and rally under the Iran's leadership. So there was a geopolitical ambition. The Hezbollah, the Iran, they all came in support of Syria. The same time, the Kurds, who have a centuries-old conflict, also saw an opportunity. They carved out a stage, which at that point of time, the US administration thought that they needed to support. Because Israelis rightly or wrongly believe that if there is any ethnic group which can actually support Israel in the long term, it is the Kurds. Because they are secular, somewhat left-leaning, and in perpetual conflict with Arabs because of the geopolitical and historical reasons. So Syrians, the Kurds created an enclave. But the Kurdish enclave created another problem. Turkey, which has a very, very restive Kurdish minority, saw that if Kurds got an enclave and could establish themselves, it will pose a threat to them. Already in Iraq, the Kurds had got substantial autonomy. So Turkey saw it as a threat to its internal cohesion. That's what I'm trying to say, how geopolitical and security implications of conflict in one country impact others. And this we need to understand. So Turkey got worried. Now, at that point of time, the US was supporting the Kurds. Then, of course, there was a US presidential election, not this one, the previous one, and Donald Trump came for the first time. A transactional leader who believes that geopolitics is nothing but a bazaar where you could trade things, trade countries and people like commodities. So he decided there's no point in being in Syria, so he pulled them out. He pulled the US troops out. The next day, the Turkey invaded, moved into the Syrian Kurdish territory, attacking them. As a result, large number of Islamic State terrorists who were actually in custody of Kurds actually escaped. Islamic State again got a fillip back. Kurds managed to hold on to some territory. They're still holding on, clinging on to it. It continued. Then what happened? And overnight you see that Syria has been run over by a former militant who is now wearing a three-piece suit, and the world looks at him, oh, reformed man. This is like people in India talking about Taliban 2.0. Where is Taliban 2.0? There is only one Taliban. People saying moderate Taliban. I said moderate Taliban is an oxymoron. If you don't understand the ideology of Taliban, you will talk of moderate Taliban. So now you have a radical Islamist who has captured Damascus. But more important is, how did it happen? The fall of Damascus did not show the weakness of Bashar al-Assad. It also showed the limitations of Russian power, and it also showed the limitations of Iranian power. Why Russia could not prevent it? Because Russia was embroiled in Russia-Ukraine war, and it has taken a toll which very often is not visualized. Why Iran could not intervene? Hezbollah had been decimated by Israel, and Iran itself was facing a threat. And that allowed Bashar al-Assad. In fact, according to reports, Russians actually virtually forced Bashar al-Assad to abdicate and move away to prevent a civil war. But does succumbing to terrorists like that resolve anything? As you saw in Afghanistan, nothing will change. These terrorists may sport a three-piece suit for a few days, but their eventual ideology remains the same. It won't change. Already women are being told, put on cover, do this. And Syria was, all said and done, may have been an autocracy, but was the most liberated society in the entire Arab world. So it's a conflict which has a huge thing. Now what has happened? Who were the supporters of this changeover? One was obviously Turkey, which doesn't want any regime in Syria which can pose a threat, because Syrians were telling Turkey that they should vacate their territory. So now you have a Turkish support with the regime. Then there is Israel. Now you'll find it very wondering. What has happened after that? Israel has not only got Golan Heights, it's actually moved beyond Golan Heights and captured territory. Israel was also very unhappy with Bashar al-Assad, because Bashar al-Assad was a strong power. It actually created a problem for them. They didn't want him there. In fact, I remember a few years back on one of my trips to Israel, they were showing a documentary. That time Syrian conflict was going on. So they say, what we are doing, we are providing humanitarian assistance. Then I saw they were providing humanitarian assistance to Al-Nusra, which was nothing but a breakaway faction of Al-Qaeda. So I said, what are you doing? Are you supporting these terrorists? They said, no, we are supporting humanitarian assistance. So I said, with so many groups in Syria, you have found only Al-Nusra to provide humanitarian assistance to? Well, that's for you to decide what happened, how it happened. So you have now to look at Syrian conflict. The geopolitical implications are for everyone to see. Now, Israel is now getting into conflict with Turkey. The Alevites, who are the prosperous and the dominant force in Syria, are actually feeling marginalized, who are a very liberated community. That's an Islamic country. Most Islamists consider them as heretics because their beliefs and where they function is just not acceptable to the hardcore Islamists. They are being targeted. But more importantly, now Israel and Turkey's interests are clashing. Hezbollah has been forced to retreat to Lebanon to guard whatever they can salvage. But most important factor, which is also being reflected in Europe, is that you cannot hypothecate your security to an external agency. Please understand, as Europe is realizing it painfully, so was Syria. Syria was dependent on Russia, Hezbollah and Iran for its security. You cannot do that. Many in India are very, very naive. People say, no, America is good ally, good friend, good thing. Please understand, alliance and allies don't work. I don't know if somebody has read history. If you read, before First World War, there was a triple alliance. Germany, Austro-Hungary and Italy. When the conflict started with Archduke Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo, and Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia went into conflict. And then subsequently France moved into it, Germany moved into it, and UK moved into it. Italy, which was in alliance with Germany and Austro-Hungary Empire, actually joined the other side. Despite being in a triple alliance, it joined the allied forces and fought against its allies. So how much is an alliance relevant? So people who advocate very strong alliance, because we have a lot of US educated, US-supported academics in our country who actually want to tie India to the apron strings of United States. We need to be very careful. You cannot hypothecate your security to external power. You have to stand on your own feet. This factor we need to understand. Well, this is what Syria was. With paucity of time, I'll just quickly cover a few more conflicts. Now let's come to Russia-Ukraine war. The most bloody conflict. When Donald Trump came to power, everybody said, now Russia-Ukraine conflict will be resolved. I also thought, let me be very honest, I also was one of those gullible things. I thought with Ukraine being pressurized, Ukraine would come to a conflict resolution with Russia. It didn't happen. It has not happened till now. It doesn't seem to be happening now. Before we come to the current, let's go to the genesis of the conflict. What is the genesis of the conflict? The genesis of the conflict was the disintegration of Soviet Union. The boundaries of most of the Commonwealth of Independent States or the former Soviet republics are artificial. Stalin's time, you decided Crimea will be with Ukraine, so it went to Ukraine. It decided there will be enclaves, Uzbek enclave inside this, Tajik enclave inside this, Kyrgyzstan, this. All sorts of artificial boundaries were created. Nagorno-Karabakh was with Azerbaijan, so this is here, so that all these boundaries were created. But what happened? So, when Soviet Union disintegrated, there were a lot of commitments made. There was a commitment made to Ukraine and Kazakhstan that you please give up your nuclear weapons and we'll ensure that your nuclear safety is there. Because when Soviet Union disintegrated, the nuclear weapons were not only in Russia, but they were also in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. They were done. Russia was given an assurance that NATO will not move eastward. Actually, NATO had no relevance after the disintegration of Soviet Union. But the Americans thought that probably served their geopolitical interests, so they continued with NATO. NATO not only moved eastward, it incorporated former Warsaw Pact countries, but once it started moving into former Soviet Union states, you already had the Baltic states as part of the NATO, and they were moving into Ukraine, that Russia realized that it's a problem. Before that, you need to understand there was a Minsk Accord. And if you go back into it, there was a president of Ukraine who was duly elected in a fairly legitimate thing, who was actually Yanukovych. He was actually pushed out because of disturbances that were sponsored by the West. So Russia had genuine grievances as far as Ukraine conflict was concerned. There was a Minsk Accord which said Luhansk and Donetsk will actually have certain autonomy, certain factors which Ukraine had violated. So Russia had genuine grievances, let there be no doubt about it. US had been telling before the war that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. What does that indicate? That says that the US intelligence had infiltrated the highest decision-making bodies in Russia. That's why they knew. At that point of time, Ukraine was trying to play it down. He's saying, no, this is fear-mongering, we don't want this, because they didn't want tourists should stop coming, the students who were coming for education should not come to Ukraine. So it was Zelensky who was telling, no, there is no war, there is no likelihood of something. The US was telling. Then what happened? The war happened. But here there is an interesting part. What Ukraine had done, Ukraine also knew that there was a conflict. Ukraine had built huge static defenses, like Maginot lines which France has done during World War. What happened? Maginot line was bypassed. First World War, they had Maginot line along the Franco-German border, but France went through Belgium and Germany went through Belgium, Netherlands, and went into France. Now what happened? Same thing was done by Ukraine. Donetsk and Luhansk were the provinces which had been declared independent just before the war started. So what did the Ukraine thought? That the conflict will come. So all their defenses, all their preparations were along the eastern borders. What happened? When the offensive came, it came from north and south. It came through Belarusian territory and it came from Crimea. And as a result, in first 24 hours, Russians were almost halfway through the Kyiv. Huge success. What does that indicate? That indicates that while Americans had infiltrated the higher decision-making body of Russians, they had not infiltrated the highest military decision-making body of the Russians, because they didn't know which direction the war will come from. They knew policy decision that invasion is coming, but they didn't know that it will come from north and south. And as a result, in first 24 hours, there was a huge success. Now, what would have happened? If Zelensky would have left like our friend in Kabul, Ukraine was finito. He didn't. To grant it to him. People may criticize him, he's a comedian, he's this, he's that, but he rallied his people. See, please understand, Ukrainian nationalism was actually a created nationalism. Under Soviet Union, there was no Ukrainian. Most of them used to speak Russians. If you go historically, Ukrainian nationalism is at best half fiction, half reality, that sort of a thing. But the conflict builds up a sense of nationalism. So Zelensky rallied his people. He said, we have enough weapons to fight. We only need manpower. And whatever he may have done, right, wrong, whatever, he managed to rally. And then Russia realized that after having gone, the initial objective of Russia was to capture Kyiv immediately, install Yanukovych, declare him as the leader of Ukraine, and get into a conflict resolutions mode. It could not happen because, and then Russia got embroiled. They didn't want to actually initially antagonize the Ukrainian population because their aim was to win them over. But a protracted war was actually leading to that. And that's how it has happened. Now, what has been the impact when you look at geopolitical impact? From Russia's point of view, it had valid reasons. But by war, what has it lost? Has it gained? Has it lost? It has lost quite a lot. Countries like Sweden, which remained neutral in 2 world wars, joined NATO. Finland, again, a country which had a treaty obligation. Now, I'm not talking of Sweden, which was by choice neutral. Finland was by treaty bound to be neutral, has applied for NATO. This is again a violation of thing. As a result, now Russia is threatening nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Again, violation of another treaty obligation to Ukraine. But more significantly, the other countries in Commonwealth of Independent States now are worried of Russia, whether they should trust him. As a result, most of the CIS countries, with barring Belarus and one odd, are now equidistant from both Russia and Ukraine. Nobody has actually taken sides in this conflict. So has it helped Russia? Geopolitically, no. It has pushed even countries like Sweden, Finland, etc. In fact, it had pushed Europe more into the arms of America. And but for Trump, it would have actually solidified the Western alliance. Of course, Trump has helped Russia a lot by actually pushing Europe outside their embrace, so probably things will work out. So when Trump pressurized Ukraine, he thought Ukraine will fall in line. But Ukraine did not. Because Europe realized that if today Ukraine goes, tomorrow somebody else will go. And now Europe has realized that they need to rearm. So you are seeing what is happening. The European funds. So please let me know when I have to wind up, because I don't have a script or something. So I'll go. 5 minutes I'll just cover Myanmar also a little, and then we just do that. Sorry. So what happened? What happened? Sorry, where was I? So what happened? Europe realized that they have to fight because they have to retort. And that's what is happening. Now, why has Russia not agreed for a ceasefire? Now, that point comes because Russia would be capturing. Because Russia realized what Ukraine did was, during this war, at the stages when Ukraine realized that it will be very difficult to dislodge Russia from bulk of its territory, it went inside and captured some territory of Russia. Now, Russia knows that if you go to a negotiating table, it will not matter how much territory you are occupying some territory, you are occupying some territory will have to be mortgaged, and it will be disproportionate. It's something like you say, you captured thousands of kilometers in Sindh, they had some small territory in Fazilka, etc. After 71, you have to exchange, it was exchanged. So Russia wants to recapture its territory before it actually negotiates, so that negotiation is only one way. How much of Ukrainian territory it will go back, which is not happening. And that's why it is. And that's why there's frustration in Trump and this. I'll quickly go because I'm taking too much of time. So, and there's no watch here. So anyway, so we'll just discuss Myanmar. That's a conflict which actually has enormous implications for us. If look east, act east has to fructify, we have to have a stable and a peaceful Myanmar. You had a conflict in Myanmar where military, see, all militaries think they have a solution for all problems of the state. And it's very easy to ride a tiger, but it's very difficult to get off a tiger, please understand. And that's what's happening in Myanmar. So military in Myanmar has captured power for too long, and they're unwilling to let go of it. And it has its implications. Now what has happened? There is an opposition, there is a national unity government which the NLD is leading. There were already ethnic armed organizations. Please understand, if you go back into the history of Myanmar, Myanmar's armed forces initially under the British were dominated by minorities. But when the Burmese actually gained independence, they actually quickly pushed. If you remember, the first commander-in-chief of Myanmar was actually from IMA. He was Karan. So he was actually shifted. So now what has happened, it's a Burma-dominated army because the ethnic armed organizations have been fighting. But some sort of peace had been brought out under NLD government. The military thought, no, not good enough. They are being marginalized. They have captured power. In the process, what has happened? You have pushed the civilian government out, which is protesting against the military takeover. And it has brought all ethnic armed organizations also. As a result, today more than 50% of the territory of Myanmar is not under the control of the government. Now what happens? There is a national unity government which is controlled by NLD, which is for name. It doesn't actually work out in any way. The ethnic armed organizations are all fighting on their own. And two of them are very important. Kachin Independence Organization has virtually captured more than half the territory of Kachin. And Arakan army has captured the entire Rakhine state except for Sitwe and one island there. That's all. The entire state. And not only have they captured the entire Rakhine state, they have captured territory in Chin state, neighboring India's Mizoram. They have also gone into the Bamar areas and have captured Irrawaddy province. So it's a very big army. They are running their own administration. They are controlling the trade with Bangladesh. And it's a matter of time before Sitwe also falls. So what happens to India's Kaladan multimodal project, which actually goes through the entire territory of theirs? Now, is a fragmented Myanmar in our interest? One would say no, not at all. You don't want a fragmented, because that chaos would probably get into India. So that's another problem which could happen. So what do? Do we align ourselves with military, as our policymakers, some of them believe? Our armed forces also believe that we should continue to collaborate with Tatmadaw. But the fact is, 2025 is not 1999. That was the last time when NLD won a resounding victory at the elections and military decided not to hand over power to them and continued to rule. Initially, we supported the opposition, and then we realized military is going nowhere, and then we had to negotiate. And we had to do an army diplomacy. Because since the army was ruling, the army chief came and called on army chief, which could not be done in Delhi, so it was done in Shillong, where then ministers came with them, and actually we did a negotiated deal in Shillong. So that was done. But what do we do now? The difference between 1999 and 2025 is technology. Today there are mobiles. Today there is social media. So the news permeates. In 1999, the regime could clamp down on communication. The communication was only under the government control, so you could hold it on. Today you can't. The opposition knows, everybody knows what's happening. And as a result, the opposition has rallied together. Now the problem is, if Myanmar fragments, it's not in our interest. Military may, just one more minute, I'll just take. Military cannot hold on to it for too long. What do? I think either we decide that we want to deal with NUG and create an umbrella organization which has a confederal system where ethnic armed organizations come under it. Please understand, when there are various groups, it's difficult for them to come to a consensus themselves. You need an external agency to mediate or arbitrate between them, and India could play that role. Most authorities in Myanmar feel that we could do that role very effectively. Incidentally, the second option is we deal directly with Kachin and Arakan army. If we don't want to accord them a Somaliland type de facto independent status, we could provide them a Puntland sort of a semi-autonomous status, which exists already in Myanmar as far as vast state is concerned, which is independent for all practical purposes, considers itself under Myanmar. But that helps us, because Arakan is the area through which we get our access to the sea for northeastern states. Our Kaladan multimodal project is there. Kachin is a mineral-rich province which is sparsely populated. Our Stillwell Road passes through it. There are critical earth minerals. There are rare earths in that particular. It's a phenomenally rich area, and they are very keen to. Please understand, Burmans by nature hate Chinese. It is because Chinese domination. Society doesn't like it. Government has no other option but to rely on this. And right now, the Chinese have forced Burman forces to retake Lashio. They've actually forced one of the insurgent organizations, MNDAA, to vacate Lashio, which they had captured with great sacrifices. They've literally forced them to actually vacate it, and they have made so much. So at this point of time, the opposition is very, very anti-Chinese. Unfortunately, we have a conservative mindset when it comes to foreign policy establishment. We are not willing to take drastic, radical actions. We are very, very conservative. We want to take that, and that's how it is. And finally, the drones usage. The drones usage in Myanmar is extensive. We are using extensively. But more importantly, in Russia-Ukraine war, where you have seen that one side is using Iranian drones and the other side is using Turkish drones. So that shows that the developed countries often have to depend on less developed technologies which have their expertise as far as certain specific fields are concerned, and how important drones are as far as these two warfares are. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Drone TV, your gateway to the latest in drone technology, GIS innovations, and AI-driven solutions. To partner with us or promote your company on Drone TV, visit www.dronetv.in. Contact us at +917 5201 23555.